I never thought I'd live to see the day when my own son, the boy I raised with my bare hands, the child whose first steps I celebrated, whose scraped knees, kissed better, would look me in the eyes and tell me I wasn't welcome in his home. It wasn't just any day, either. It was Christmas. The lights were glowing all across the neighborhood. Families were gathering. Laughter was spilling out of warm houses into the frosty night, and me. I was standing on my son's front porch, holding a wrapped gift in my hand, my heart pounding like it was about to burst out of my chest. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Walking in, hugging my grandchildren, sitting down to a table filled with food and memories. But instead, the door opened just enough for me to see his face cold. Distant. Nothing like the little boy I remembered. "Dad," he said flatly, "you shouldn't have come. You're not welcome here tonight." The words hit me like ice water down my spine. I stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to believe what I was hearing. My own son. On Christmas Eve, shutting the door in my face, I forced a weak smile, not wanting him to see how much it hurt. I managed to whisper, "Merry Christmas." "Son," before the door clicked shut. Behind that door, I could already hear laughter. Plates clinking, his wife's voice. The sound of my grandchildren, opening presents. And I was outside in the cold, alone. I walked slowly back to my car, the snow crunching under my shoes. I sat there for a long time, staring at the gift still in my lap. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Anger. Heartbreak. I had always been there for him. Through school, through college, through the early years when he struggled to find his footing, I gave him everything I had. My time, my money, my sacrifices. And this was my reward? To be cast out like a stranger? But that night, as the clock struck midnight, I made myself a quiet promise. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry at his doorstep. I was going to take back everything I had given him. He thought he could erase me from his life. But by the new year, he would learn a lesson he'd never forget, because the house he was so proudly celebrating Christmas in, it wasn't really his, and soon. He would find that out the hard way. Transition gives narrator shifts tone, but before I tell you how I made that promise come true, you need to understand how we got here. How a father and son could reach the point of such cold betrayal, and why the house he thought was his castle was built on foundations I had laid long before he ever stepped foot inside. Asterisk. People often assume that broken families are born out of loud fights, slammed doors, and years of shouting matches. But in my case, it was silence. Little moments, small choices that piled up like dust on a shelf until one day, it was impossible to ignore. When my son was born, he was the brightest light in my life. I still remember the first time I held him, so tiny, so fragile, yet so powerful in the way he changed me. His little fingers curled around mine, and I promised him right then and there that I would do whatever it took to give him a good life, and I meant it. I wasn't born rich. Far from it. I worked construction jobs, odd shifts, sometimes 2 at once, just to make ends meet. There were nights I'd come home with calloused hands, every bone aching. But the moment I saw him sleeping peacefully, I knew it was worth it. My wife and I did without plenty so he could have more. New shoes for him, second-hand ones for us. Hot meals for him, sandwiches for me on the go. I never thought of it as a burden. That's what parents do, right? We pour ourselves out so our children can stand taller than we ever could. And for a while, I thought it worked. He was smart, ambitious. I cheered at his school plays, clapped the loudest at his graduations, and beamed with pride when he got into university. But slowly, something shifted. At first it was subtle. Phone calls I made that went unanswered. Family dinners he skipped, saying he was too busy. Birthdays where he promised he'd stop by, but only sent a quick text instead. I brushed it off, telling myself, he's young, he's building his life, it's normal. But deep down, I felt it. The distance growing. Then came the money. See, when he graduated, he didn't have much saved. He wanted to buy a house, settle down with the woman he loved. And once again, I did what I had always done. I gave. I pulled from my savings. The same savings I had built for my retirement, and I told him, son, don't worry. You go live your life. Build your home. I'll be fine. His eyes lit up with gratitude. He hugged me tight, said he'd never forget what I had done for him. And in that moment, I believed him. I even went further. The house he proudly calls his today, I was the one who signed for it, helped with the down payment, and backed him when the bank hesitated. Without me, those keys would have never been in his pocket. But once the house was his, so was the silence. Calls became rarer, invitations fewer, and slowly it felt less like I was his father and more like I was some distant relative he tolerated out of obligation. The final straw came not long before that fateful Christmas. I had shown up one evening, unannounced, not to interfere, just to drop off some groceries I thought they might need. His wife opened the door, and though she was polite, I could see it in her eyes. I wasn't wanted there. When my son came to the door, he didn't even invite me in. He stood on the porch, arms folded, saying, "Dad, you can't just drop by like this. We need our own space." I smiled, trying to hide the sting. "Of course, son. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." He sighed, exasperated. "We're fine. Really. You don't have to worry about us anymore." That line. You don't have to worry about us anymore. As if my role in his life was over. As if decades of sacrifice, love, and sleepless nights were suddenly erased, boxed up, and shoved into the attic like some old memory. I drove home that night with tears in my eyes, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I told myself it was just a phase, that things would get better, but they didn't. So when Christmas came, when I stood on that porch holding a gift for my grandchildren and heard him say, "You're not welcome here," it wasn't just about that night. It was about every ignored call, every cold shoulder, every quiet rejection that led us here. It was betrayal. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, painful kind that cuts deeper than any knife. And as I sat in my car that night, staring at the wrapped present I'd never get to hand to my grandkids, a new thought entered my mind. He had forgotten where he came from. He had forgotten who had lifted him up. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for a reminder. Because the house he was so proudly hosting Christmas in, the one filled with lights, laughter, and gifts under the tree, it wasn't really his. And if he thought he could shut me out of his life so easily, he was about to learn what happens when you bite the hand that built the very foundation you're standing on. Asterisk. I sat there in my car on Christmas Eve, the engine humming softly, the glow of their house still shining in my rearview mirror. Inside, I could see shadows moving, people laughing, children running. My grandchildren. My blood and me. I was on the outside. Always on the outside now. The gift I had wrapped with such care lay heavy on the passenger seat, mocking me with its bright red ribbon. I had picked it out weeks before, a wooden train set, the kind I knew my grandson would love. I had even carved their initials on the bottom, just like I used to do for my son when he was small. But that little boy I once carved toys for, he was gone, replaced by a man who looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not welcome." The words replayed in my mind like a cruel echo. Not welcome. Not wanted. Not needed. My chest ached, and for a moment I thought I might break down right there in the driveway. But then something shifted. Slowly, my lips curled into a smile. Not a happy smile. No, a knowing smile. Because in that moment, I remembered something he seemed to have forgotten. That house. The one he thought was his kingdom, his fortress, his fresh start with his family. It wasn't truly his. Without me, without my signature, without my money. That house would have been nothing more than a dream. And while he might have forgotten, the paperwork hadn't. The bank hadn't. The law certainly hadn't. I had stayed silent for too long. I had let him drift further and further away, hoping he'd come back on his own. But this was the final straw. As I gripped the steering wheel tighter, I whispered to myself, "All right, son. You don't want me in your life? Let's see how well you do without me." I started the car, the tires crunching against the icy road as I pulled away. But instead of going home, I drove. Nowhere in particular, just drove, letting the night air clear my thoughts. Street after street lit with Christmas lights, families gathering, warmth spilling from every window. Each house I passed reminded me of what I had lost, and then the thought struck me like a lightning bolt. Maybe I hadn't lost anything at all. Maybe it was still mine to take back. You see, when I had helped him buy that house, I hadn't simply handed him the money and walked away. No, I was smarter than that. I had insisted on being a co-signer. My name was on the mortgage. My name was on the documents. Legally, I still had a stake. Back then, I had done it out of love. I wanted to protect him, to make sure if anything went wrong, I could step in and help. But now that same signature was going to be the very thing that reminded him of who had made his life possible. As the realization settled in, the pain in my chest began to ease, replaced by something else: resolve. Cold, steady resolve. I knew what I had to do. By New Year's, the laughter inside that house would turn to silence. The same silence he had given me, only louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. But don't misunderstand me. I wasn't out to destroy my son. I wasn't out to ruin his life completely. No, that's not the kind of man I am. What I wanted was something different. I wanted him to feel the weight of betrayal, to feel what it's like to be left out in the cold, to understand that when you cast aside the very person who built your foundation, that foundation can crumble beneath you. As I finally pulled into my driveway that night, the snow falling quietly around me, I turned off the car and sat in the darkness for a long while. My hand rested on the gift beside me. For a moment, I thought about leaving it on his doorstep anyway. A desperate part of me wanted my grandchildren to know that their grandfather still cared. But then I shook my head. Not this time. This time the lesson wasn't just for my son. It was for his whole family. His wife, who looked at me like I was a burden. His children, who barely knew me because of the distance he had created. They all needed to understand. I carried the gift inside, set it down in the corner of my living room, and sat in my old chair by the window. The clock ticked, each second pushing me closer to midnight. When the hour struck, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made a vow. By the new year, things will be different. By the new year, he'll understand what it means to shut out his own father. And with that silent promise, I began to plan. Asterisk, when I woke up the next morning, the cold felt different. It wasn't just the weather, it was the air after a decision has been made. There was no going back. I'd promised myself a lesson, not a tantrum. So I sat down with a cup of coffee, the steam fogging the window, and made a list. Quiet, careful steps. No shouting. No dramatic scenes. Just the kind of slow, steady pressure that makes people finally look up and pay attention. First rule: don't act like someone out for revenge. That's amateur hour. If I wanted him to really feel the consequences, had to be smart, legal, practical, unquestionable, paperwork and patience. That was the angle. You already know my name was on the mortgage. That detail used to be a comfort, a backstop, something that reassured me if things ever went wrong with my son. Now it was leverage. But leverage isn't a hammer. It's a tool. You use it carefully, or it snaps. I visited the files I had tucked away in the little cabinet by my desk, the loan papers, the envelopes from the bank, the stamped documents I kept like relics. I spread them out on the table like an old map, tracing the dates with my finger, revisiting old signatures, remembering the day I'd signed them with pride and hopefulness. How different that felt now. Step 2. Gather facts. I called the bank not angrily, not with a demand, just as a concerned co-signer checking on an account. The person on the other end was polite, dry, professional. I asked about payment schedules. I asked about notices. I listened more than I spoke. Everything they said was useful. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just the cold reality of numbers and dates and due notices. What I learned was straightforward. Loans are not about feelings. They are about payments. Miss a payment, and the machine starts to turn. Miss enough, and the bank sends letters. Ignore the letters, and they take the next steps. There was my opening. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because he needed to feel the consequences of closing a door on his father. But I'm not a cruel man. I didn't intend to engineer a financial ruin. Instead, I planned to remind him in a way that wouldn't be erased by anger or excuses, that the safety he enjoyed was built with help. He had been careless with relationships. I would be precise with facts. Step 3. Subtle pressure. I began with small, harmless moves. I sent a few polite, formal letters. As his cosigner, I had the right to request statements and loan information. I requested copies of recent mortgage statements to make sure everything was in order. The letters were polite, legally worded. No threats. No emotional pleas. Just a cosigner fulfilling a responsibility. If he was paying on time, nothing would come of it. If he wasn't, the paperwork would show it in black and white. And black and white doesn't lie. I also quietly checked other things. Utility bills. Property tax notices. I made a list of dates and amounts. Every small overdue notice that I could find would be a clear, unemotional fact to present. I wasn't the sort to shout about love and history. I was a man with evidence. Evidence speaks where hurt feelings cannot. While I was assembling paper trails, I planned my next move. The conversation I didn't want to have in anger, but that I wanted to have with all eyes open. I would not beg at his doorstep. I would not show up uninvited. I would let facts do the talking. I would let the machinery of responsibility reveal what kindness he had taken for. Granted. But there's another side to this story that people don't talk about much. The power of public truth. People hide behind polite manners and holiday lights. But the truth has a way of showing up at the worst possible moments for those who avoid it. So I made a quiet decision. If it came down to proving a point, I would be prepared to act in front of the people who mattered, not to humiliate, but to illuminate, to let his neighbors, his friends, his family see that the life he was living was supported by someone he had turned away as I prepared. I also thought about timing. There's a difference between an impulsive reaction that fades and a slow lesson that changes behavior. I decided to wait, not forever, but until the beginning of the new year. New beginnings are when people take stock. New Year's resolutions, bank statements, budgets. If the first notice arrived around then, it would have more weight than a random letter lost in the holiday shuffle. It would be a clear bookend to the moment he shut me out on Christmas. Days passed. I continued to act like an ordinary man doing ordinary things, fixing a broken step. There were small moments that tested me. A neighbor told me his daughter had seen me walking past their house the day after Christmas. A cousin texted asking if I was all right. Once, I nearly called my son directly, the urge to speak rising like a tide. But I reminded myself, this wasn't about immediate satisfaction. It was about a lesson with teeth. A consequence that wasn't cruel. That would be undeniable. There's a certain satisfaction that comes from doing things the right way, from keeping your dignity while you collect your evidence. I took that satisfaction in small sips, like black coffee in the early morning. It wasn't about gloating. It was about integrity. If he had a problem with that, then he would have to explain it in front of a reality he could not dodge. In the last week of the year, I took one more careful step. I arranged a face-to-face meeting, not with him, but with a neutral party. A lawyer. A person who could explain obligations without emotion, who could point to documents and say simply what they meant. I wanted a professional voice that would carry weight in a room where mine might otherwise be dismissed as biased. When the lawyer explained what co-signing meant, when she showed me what rights a co-signer has if payments are missed, I felt a chill, not of fear, but of certainty. I wasn't playing games. I was prepared to protect what had been put in my name. That protection could look like a gentle nudge, a formal notice, a request for payment, or, if push came to shove. But my aim was never to strip him of everything. It was to wake him up. I left the lawyer's office with a folder of formal documents, copies of the mortgage, notes on the legal steps, a clear outline of what would be needed to secure the loan if payments were missed. The papers were practical, matter-of-fact. They were also final in a way that heartfelt pleas sometimes aren't. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks bloomed in the distant sky and people hugged and drank 2 fresh starts, I sat at my kitchen table and laid out the plan one last time. Not in anger, but in resolution. If he had been paying his share, nothing would change. My letters would be nothing more than paperwork in a cabinet. But if he hadn't, if he had taken for granted what I had offered, then the truth would arrive like a quiet, cold knock at the door, and when that knock came, he would have to choose, mend what was broken, or watch as the safety net he had used without thanks was pulled away. Either way, he would feel the weight of his choices. That was the point. Not to destroy, but to make certain that the memory of what he'd done, of closing the door on his father on Christmas night, would never be so easy to forget, because sometimes lessons aren't given with shouting and fury. Sometimes they are given with documents and deadlines, and sometimes that is the kindest way to make someone finally see. Asterisk, New Year's morning arrived, cold and quiet. The streets outside were littered with bits of fireworks and confetti, reminders of the celebrations I hadn't been part of. People were making resolutions, setting goals, hugging their loved ones. Me. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a plain white envelope. It didn't look like much, just paper, folded neatly, sealed with glue. But inside it was the first step of the plan. Not a threat, not anger. Just the truth, written in black ink, wrapped in formality. I had mailed the letter 2 days earlier, timed so it would land in his mailbox on New Year's Day or the day after. Perfect timing. While others were making promises about new beginnings, he would be opening a reminder of old debts. The letter was simple. It explained that, as the co-signer on the house, I had been reviewing the mortgage details. It noted my legal right to request statements, and it gently hinted at the possibility of further steps if obligations weren't consistently met. No accusations. No shouting. Just facts, and facts are harder to ignore than feelings. I could imagine his face as he read it. That little tightening around the jaw he always had when he felt cornered. The way his eyes would dart to his wife, searching for a lifeline, trying to decide whether to downplay it or admit what he feared. But here's the thing. I didn't need to imagine for long, because silence started talking. 3 days into the new year, my phone rang. Not from him, no. He was still too proud for that. It was from his wife. Her voice was polite, but there was a sharp edge under every word. Hello. I understand you've been in touch with the bank. I let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. Yes. As a co-signer, I have every right to check on the account. Is there a problem? Her breath caught just slightly. That tiny pause told me everything I needed to know. There's no problem, she said quickly. Everything is fine. We just didn't realize you were still involved? Didn't realize I was still involved. The words dripped with the same dismissal I'd felt on Christmas Eve. They had wanted me out of sight, out of mind, erased from the foundation of their lives. But paper doesn't forget, and signatures don't disappear. Well, I said evenly, my name is still on the documents, and until it isn't, I remain very much involved. There was another pause. I could almost hear her thinking, her pride wrestling with her fear. She ended the call quickly, muttering something about talking later. I hung up, leaned back in my chair and smiled. Not a cruel smile, just the smile of someone who finally feels the tide beginning to turn. The silence that followed was heavy, almost louder than words. No phone calls from my son, no apologies, no invitations, but I knew they were talking about it behind closed doors, whispering, arguing, maybe even blaming each other. That was fine. Let the silence do its work. A week passed, and then another. The second letter went out, this one from my lawyer, formal and clear. It reminded them of the obligations on the loan, outlined the potential consequences of default, and copied me on every word. Again, no threats, no dramatics, just facts. That's when the real shock landed. Because this time, it wasn't his wife who called. It was my son. I'll never forget the sound of his voice. Tense, defensive, a little too loud, as though raising the volume would make the truth easier to ignore. "Dad, what are you doing? Why are you involving yourself in this?" I took a breath, calm and steady. "I'm not involving myself, son. I've always been involved." "You just forgot." He started to protest, muttering about how they were handling everything, how it wasn't necessary for me to interfere. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became. They weren't handling everything. Payments had been late. Bills had piled up. The life they were showing to the world wasn't as stable as they wanted everyone to believe. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me being shut out of Christmas. This was about them living on a foundation of denial, ignoring the very structure holding them up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said, "Son, if you truly don't need me, then this won't be an issue. But if you do, you'll need to start remembering the truth and respecting it." The line went quiet. For a moment I thought he had hung up. Then I heard him sigh, long and heavy, like the weight of years pressing down on him. "Dad," he began, but the words trailed off. He couldn't finish. He wasn't ready. Not yet. We ended the call without resolution, but that was fine, because the silence that followed was even louder than before. He knew. He understood. And the lesson had only just begun. The days after that phone call felt like standing on the edge of a storm. The air was heavy, charged, waiting for lightning to strike. On the surface, life went on. I went about my routines, greeted neighbors, read the morning paper. But beneath it all, I knew something had shifted. My son could no longer pretend I didn't exist, and the cracks in their household were starting to show. One evening, as I stepped out to bring in the mail, I caught sight of them across the street. My son and his wife were standing on their porch, voices raised, hands gesturing sharply in the cold air. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I had lived long enough to recognize the rhythm of an argument: accusation, denial, interruption, silence. Then it would start again, louder. The truth had slipped into their home like water through a crack, and no amount of patching could keep it from spreading inside my house. I sat quietly, sipping tea, letting the silence wrap around me. I wasn't celebrating their struggle. I wasn't enjoying their pain. No, this wasn't about revenge, not anymore. This was about reality catching up to pride, and pride, when cornered, is dangerous. 2 weeks later, received a letter from the bank, a formal notice of delinquency. Payments had been missed, deadlines ignored, and my name was right there, printed alongside theirs. As accountable as ever, that was the moment I knew. It was time to act. I contacted my lawyer, sat in his office surrounded by stacks of neatly arranged files, and laid it out clearly. "I want the house sold," I said firmly. "If they cannot uphold their end, then I will take mine back. Legally, properly. No drama, just the law." The lawyer nodded, not surprised. He had seen this before. Families torn between pride and responsibility. He drafted the necessary documents, each one a nail in the coffin of denial. When the notice was served, I didn't hear from them for 3 days. No phone calls, no visits, just silence. But silence, by now, had become my ally. I knew it was working on them, pressing down harder than any argument ever could. Finally, on the 4th day, the knock came. I opened the door to find my son standing there. Shoulders hunched, eyes darker than I'd ever seen. He didn't look like the confident man he tried to present to the world. He looked tired, worn, a boy again, standing in front of his father, hoping for mercy but too proud to ask. "Dad," he said, voice low, "can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him in. We sat across from each other at the table, the same table where, weeks earlier, I had sat alone with that first envelope. Now, the circle had come full. He started slowly, words catching in his throat. I should have called earlier. I should have explained. Things have been harder than I let on. The house, the bills. It's not what you think. I let him speak. let the flood pour out. The missed payments, the arguments with his wife, the fear of losing face in front of friends and family. Every word was a brick removed from the wall of pride he had built around himself. When he finally fell silent, I leaned forward and said the words that had been waiting in me all along. Son, pride won't pay the bills. Pride won't save the roof over your head. And pride won't heal the wound you cut on Christmas Eve when you turned your back on me. But reality. Reality can set you free. If you let it. He lowered his gaze, shame flickering across his face. I didn't mean to shut you out, Dad, I thought. I thought I had to prove I didn't need you anymore. I placed my hand on the table, steady and calm. Needing someone isn't weakness. It's family. And family doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't hostile. It was cleansing. Like the pause after a storm, when the air smells of rain and the sky begins to clear. That night, for the first time in years, we didn't speak as adversaries. We spoke as father and son. He admitted his mistakes. I acknowledged my hurt. And somewhere between the words, the healing began. But the story wasn't finished. The legal wheels were already in motion. The house wasn't safe. The consequences of his pride were still coming, and I had a choice to make. Would I pull back, offer him a way out, extend my hand fully, or would I let the process unfold, teaching him the hardest lesson of all, that every action has a cost? I didn't answer that question that night. Some decisions need to rest in silence until the right moment comes. Asterisk, the day came colder than I expected. A sharp wind swept through the neighborhood, rattling the bare branches and whistling against the windows. The kind of day that feels restless, as if even the weather knows something is about to happen. That morning, I stood at my window, watching their house across the street. My son's home, the one I had quietly financed, the one they had proudly claimed as their own. A for sale sign now stood planted in the frozen ground, bright and unyielding. It was no longer just a house. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, the truth was finally staring back at them. Neighbors slowed down as they passed, whispering to each other, curious, maybe even shocked. The house had always been a symbol of their pride, their independence, their so-called success. Now, the silence around it was louder than any words. By afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. It's official, he said. The house will be listed within the week. The paperwork is signed, the process is moving. I thanked him, but my mind wasn't on the legalities. My thoughts were with my son. How would he face this? What would he say when pride had nowhere left to hide? That evening, the knock came again, but this time it wasn't hesitant. It was sharp, hurried, desperate. I opened the door to find both of them, my son and his wife, standing there. She looked angry, her eyes sharp and fiery. He looked exhausted, shoulders slumped under a weight no one else could carry. "You can't do this," she blurted out, her voice breaking. "This is our home. You can't just take it away." I kept my tone calm, even. It's not about taking anything away. It's about responsibility. It was never just yours. It was ours. And when you shut me out, you shut out the truth. She glared at me, but behind her eyes was fear. Fear of losing the image she had built, fear of facing neighbors, fear of starting over. My son reached out, touched her arm, and pulled her back gently. His voice, softer now, carried more weight than hers ever could. "Dad, I know you're right. I know this is my fault. I let pride get in the way. I shut you out when I should have let you in." The honesty in his voice struck deeper than I expected. It wasn't just admission. It was surrender. Not to me, but to reality. I let the silence linger before answering. "Sometimes, son, a house isn't just walls and a roof. Sometimes it's a lesson. And right now, this house is teaching all of us." They said nothing. She turned her face away, wiping a tear quickly as if no one had seen. He stayed still, staring at the ground, waiting for me to continue. I stepped closer, my voice lower, steady. "You see, family isn't built on pride. It's built on trust. You thought Christmas was about keeping me out to prove something? But Christmas isn't about pride. It's about opening the door even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. He lifted his head slowly, eyes glistening, and whispered, "I'm sorry." "Dad?" 3 words. Simple. Heavy. Words I had waited years to hear. But never thought I would. For a long moment, none of us moved. The wind rattled the windows, the clock ticked in the hallway. Life went on around us. But inside that doorway, something shifted. Pride had broken. The wall had fallen. And what was left, raw, vulnerable, honest, was finally real. I didn't answer with anger. I didn't respond with lectures. I placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "This house may not stay yours. But family? Family will. If you choose it." His wife looked up at me then, her anger dimmed, her eyes softer now. She didn't speak, but in her silence, I saw something I hadn't seen before: recognition. Maybe even respect. The moment passed, but its weight stayed. They left that night quietly, their footsteps fading into the cold street. And I stood in the doorway long after, watching the signs sway in the winter wind. Knowing that some lessons come not with anger, but with truth, the house would be sold. That much was certain. But what mattered more had already begun. A door that had been shut on Christmas was finally opening again. Not with pride, but with humility. And sometimes, that's the greatest revenge of all, not to destroy, but to expose, to reveal. To make the truth impossible to ignore. The house had spoken, and its voice was louder than anything I could ever say. The weeks that followed felt strangely calm, as if the storm had finally passed. The for sale sign remained in front of their house, swaying with each gust of winter wind. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time in years, there was no silence between us. No walls built of pride or unspoken anger. Instead, there were phone calls. Short ones at first. A check-in here, a question there, then longer ones. Conversations that didn't feel like battles, but like bridges being rebuilt. One word at a time. It amazed me how quickly things began to change once truth had entered the picture. Pride had once been the loudest voice in our family, but now, humility spoke louder. Regret had softened into understanding. And through it all, I could see my son. Not just the man he wanted the world to believe he was, but the boy I had once raised. Flawed. Yes. Stubborn, certainly. But still my son. The house sale moved forward. My lawyer updated me on each step, and with every call, the reality became clearer. This chapter was closing. Yet instead of bitterness, I felt peace. Because I realized something profound. It wasn't the house that mattered. It never had been. The house was only ever a stage. The real story had been happening all along inside us one cold morning. As the first hints of spring tried to push through the frost, my son came by again. This time, without anger, without desperation, just honesty. He sat at my kitchen table, the same place where he had once argued, and said quietly, "Dad, I know we're losing the house. And maybe we deserve that. But I don't want to lose this again. Not you, not family. I don't care about the walls or the roof anymore. I just don't want to live like strangers." His words carried no pride, no performance, just truth. And it was enough. I reached across the table, laid my hand on his, and nodded. Then let's start over. A house can be rebuilt. Money can be earned again. But family, once lost, it's harder to bring back. We've been given another chance. Let's not waste it. He swallowed hard, emotions flickering across his face, then whispered, "Thank you." That day. The for sale sign didn't look like defeat anymore. It looked like release. Like the ending of one story and the beginning of another, the house eventually sold. They moved into a smaller place, more modest, more manageable. And though it wasn't as grand or impressive, something about it felt right, real. They invited me over one evening. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but the warmth inside was stronger than anything money could buy. As I sat with them, laughter filling the space where pride once ruled, I realized the truth. Revenge isn't always about destroying someone's world. Sometimes the greatest revenge is letting truth do its work. Pride collapses. Masks fall. And in that quiet aftermath, something stronger can finally grow. Christmas came around again the next year. This time, there was no argument. No cold rejection, no closed door. Instead, I was the first one invited. And when I walked into their new home, the smell of food filling the air. My son hugged me tightly, not as a man proving his independence, but as a son grateful for forgiveness. And that's when I understood the real lesson. Life will always test us with betrayal, pride, and broken trust. But the way we respond defines who we are. You can let bitterness consume you, or you can let truth expose what needs to be seen. Revenge doesn't always need fire or fury. Sometimes it simply needs patience and the courage to let reality speak louder than anger. As I looked around the table that Christmas, I didn't see enemies or strangers. I saw family. Imperfect, yes, but still family. And for me, that was enough. Because in the end, houses may be lost, but the true home is built in the bonds we choose to protect. And that is where pride finally falls, and family rises again.